Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WAFC Champaign, 90.1 in your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Today is Sunday, February the 24th, the last Sunday of February. And you're tuned to WEFT, and this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, conservation, and everything else that Dave has been up to.
So, in passing, said record this morning, yesterday Bernadine Stake passed. She was an activist, a planner. She was on the Urbana City Council Planning Commission for something like 10 years. Staunch Democrat, ran for mayor at one stage, and just known for bringing people together. She was on our Heartland Pathways board and has 4 children. Travels with her husband quite a bit when he's a emeritus professor in education. I can remember her going to Albury in Australia with her husband, and my sister took her to interesting places on the Victoria, and so we shared some of those experiences. More details later. Lex Yule, my high school and university buddy, passed away recently, and he was school captain at an agricultural high school that we both attended, and he became a dentist and just a very exceptional guy, football player, stocky and athletic, and I had been sending him emails and calling and not getting a reply, so, and then I found out he'd passed. UPTV has been going through some changes. Jake Shoemaker has retired as the manager, and I unfortunately missed going to his retirement party yesterday, but all the best to Jake. He has worked with WIL, and he will be hard to replace. Urbana does something unique with public television that just doesn't happen in Champaign, and it's very friendly, and it provides an outlet for people in Champaign like ourselves, as well as for Urbana. And it has difficulty knowing how to garner funds for, especially from people who use it, often people who don't have a lot of money, not-for-profits, but I think they do a very good job with that. So there's a management, and Jason Liggett is a technical person, and then Foltz is the chair of the commission that covers that. I want to remind you that we'll be going this week to Prairie State Conservation Coalition meeting at Starved Rock. David will be there too, and it's an attempt to bring people together, to provide some educational opportunity to talk to the politics of natural areas, to sort on rules, to bring together some of the people who are expert in doing this and giving the general hoi polloi that owns and operates open space, brings those sorts of people together. It's held just south of Route 80 at Starved Rock State Park, and it's just a 1.5 day event which we enjoy. David, you might have some comment about that sort of meeting?
Sure, just in brief. It's a great way to reinvigorate your spirit. It sounds kind of geeky, but as time goes on, you get used to doing certain things certain ways, and it's really neat to meet up with people who are doing different things. Last time, someone put together a video that was only about 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes long, that showed when a group near Chicago, I believe, purchased a waterway and turned it back into a wiggle woggle rather than a straight line that the farmer had it. Animals that had moved out because it became useless to them came back again. The beavers came in and would put in dams. The tall wading birds showed up again. It was just the coolest thing to watch. If you reclaim things, it does not take all that long at all for nature to reassert herself. And so it was great fun. I'll even have to say that, what's his name, George Schumacher, maybe? He's a lawyer. Covington, thank you, George Covington. And every year that I've been there, this will be my 4th year now, he tells you things that have changed in the legislature. It sounds really dry in a way it is, but it's really cool to find out. Again, the legislature is actually making improvements in many cases to make things easier for people who are doing conservation work. So it's great fun being up there.
Yes. So if there's any of you out there that might like to go, it's fairly close. It's held at Starved Rock so that people from the south of the state can get there, and also get all the people from Chicago. And it probably runs 150 people, something like that. And it's an interesting park to be there in the first place. Starved Rock has some history, and there's a dam there that generates a lot of fish, and as a result there's eagles nearby. You can see them nesting, and that's interesting too. I wanted to say something about Route 45. I watched Route 45. It's gone over the years from 2 lanes to 3 lanes to 5 lanes. And there's a 10-foot strip between the edge of the active road and prairie planting. And by negotiation, the strip down to the waterway or the drainage ditch was planted to short spectrum prairie grasses, only grasses, because they grow fairly well, and they are visible. A strip right adjacent to the 10-foot space between the active road and the prairie, there was planted a switchgrass. Switchgrass is fairly tough, stays up over winter, and it has a fair degree of fuel matrix. Fuel matrix being the sort of fuel that provides for lightning strike or accidental cigarette butt or something that sets it afire. If you mow that, it accumulates the litter and makes it possible for a fire. Controlled burns can prevent spontaneous fires. We're there in South 45, just south of Champaign in Savoy. It's adjacent to a shopping mall, but as is most of the cases, roads followed the railroad lines. So adjacent is a railroad bed, and it is often very difficult to do a control burn because you're adjacent to a railroad. And if you do burn, you need people who are experienced, who know not to get smoke across a railroad line or conversely across the roadway. Both can lead to accidents. If the smoke is, if you have the temerity of burning too late in the season when the grass is green, then you're going to have smoke. So you have to choose your burn time. Often it's during winter. You don't have to burn all of it, and probably won't because of patches of snow or ice left. But it requires people at the state or federal level and the railroads to be able to get together and feel responsible about doing a burn. This is not just your casual burn. But if you don't burn, the litter will accumulate. So I walked the whole area. It has been mown on the downside. And let's give you a cross spectrum. If you walk from the 10-foot free space on the side of the road, which gives vehicles a chance to get off and park if necessary, it's a highway. So people don't usually do that, but if they have to, they can. The downslope to the local drain is planted to low spectrum prairie grasses, no broadleaves. On the upside, on the other side, we were allowed to retain the prairie that was there and or augment it with planted seedings or actual plants. And the prairie in itself was between the Department of Transportation road right-of-way and the railroad right-of-way. The site is also imposed on by a power grid that comes up to the university, and it's used to have wooden poles that are subject to fire if it happens with lightning or with accidental combustion. And it needs to be mown to remove the trees. At the north end near Windsor Road, where a bridge was installed, there is a lot of brush growing, and if that brush is allowed to grow, it will short out the power line to the ground. That happens when there are old power lines. So those power lines have been replaced by huge aluminum or composition steel and metals to high towers, much higher than the wooden poles. And they're on a pedestal that goes down 10 feet in the soft glaciated soil to make sure that that pole does not fall over. Poles that are where the power lines change directions are even taller and even more substantial pedestals. So that has happened in the last few years, but the additional mowing of the slope from the road down to the ditch is a little frightening because it means that there is more fuel matrix and more chance of a spontaneous burn. It really needs to have state involvement, railroad involvement, and Department of Transportation involvement, as well as local involvement with the Savoy Village Board, which likes to have the prairie there. Not everyone likes to have the prairie. It could be a mown territory, but this is a place which is very public and a chance to give people an indication of what their heritage prairie is, and the original prairie is down to 0.01% being saved by the state. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't little pieces around here and there, but it's very, very low for a gene pool. And you need it for biochemicals, you need it for plants and animals, and that we need to pay attention to. There's another problem in that this is rather flat country on the backside of the Posota Moraine, and the village drainage comes into the ditch that runs alongside the road. And this is a problem because the territory is so flat that that water doesn't drain very well, and that creates wet spots that are rather swampy. And every once in a while, that drainage ditch has to be cleaned out with the hope that it will flow down towards Windsor Road, which is lower. It also means that there have to be riprap on the banks to prevent erosion, because water does not necessarily run in a straight line. It runs in a meander fashion. So over the years, that ditch tends to become a meandering corridor, and that then gets to be a question of whether the meanders are slowing the escape of the water. Much of Champaign County was very, very damp, so we're used to this sort of drainage problem, but it also allows certain trees to grow, and then you have the power grid has problems of the trees shorting to the ground. So my walk went down the roadside side of 45, but it also went up on the east side, which is adjacent to the university and also has power lines on it. But also the trees have been allowed to grow there, so there should be some control of that vegetation so that it doesn't embarrass the power lines that go to provide for the university. There's a nice little prairie on the Windsor Road, and that does well, but every so often it gets mown back too. And and the sign, which was normally at an angle so that people could see it, has been turned sideways, so you don't really see that this is an intentional prairie. On the south side of Windsor Road, there's a 15-acre solar panel project which provides low carbon energy to the university. It's a small amount, perhaps only 2% of the university's needs, but it's an exercise in putting together solar panels. So, and it is adjacent to native prairie that's on the south side of Windsor Road, and that too now has been mown. It makes a statement, but I think we have to watch carefully the use of mowing. It's expensive in terms of utilization. It doesn't encourage biodiversity, and over we're beginning to realize that people who have backyards, front yards, they do encourage all sorts of creatures, small mammals, butterflies and insects that pollinate. And they don't only pollinate the prairie, but they pollinate the plants that we need for food. Our biodiversity for food is low. We have about 10 or at most 15 plants that provide our food. They grow so that they grow effectively. They can be fertilized. They can be controlled with pesticide and chemicals. But if we're not careful, that monoculture of corn and soybeans and sometimes some wheat and oats is not making use of the plants that were adapted to this sort of community. There are plants out there that look like weeds, that are broadleaves, that actually are worked by bumblebees, that are getting to be endangered because they don't have the habitat that they need to work. So this weekend there was a insect fear festival, and that alerts people to the fact that insects are involved extensively in our well health. And how do we encourage it? We encourage it by taking some of those roadside prairies, which is about the only prairies we have left. They're between the railroad and the roadside that followed the railroad. And unfortunately, the roads keep getting widened out of that railroad right away. But it takes a lot of understanding for people to give permission to burn the accumulated litter, which, if not carefully controlled, will not only downgrade the prairie because it's used to, it's had a million years of opportunity to adapt to this sort of thing. So 10,000 years ago, when the glaciers moved back, the prairie plants that came in are those that are adapted to rich, deep soils like Drummer and Flanagan soils, and to mesic soils that are a little drier, and then dry soils. And this glaciated landscape with glacial till that has been dropped and provides us with excellent farm land has been utilized to the extent that the only places where there is original prairie with all its bacteria and fungi and microorganisms and mammals and insects is what we have left. So perhaps one of the things that I will say something about at the Prairie States Conservation Coalition is that we need to have some basic relationship with the railroads, that we know how to burn a little at a time, and with care. We don't have to have smoke, but it needs to be done fairly early in the season before the broadleaves and the grasses get to be green. I walk along and already an invasive hemlock plant is growing even in the cold of winter. It's there and green, and it will take off very quickly. This is a rather wonderful prairie. It has the support of quite a few people who like to see it. On a football day when the traffic is going very slow, there are people who can look and see monarda or various clovers and just an array of native prairie plants. And for its health, we need to remove that litter that allows heat and light to get into the prairie plants that are mostly perennial and they're underground, so they will come out in spring. But if they're covered with a dense cover of dead litter from past seasons, then they get to be more depauperate. So if you have a prairie that's not mown and you leave it for 10 years, gradually the prairie gets lower and lower and thicker and thicker. And this has been something that's happened naturally for years. You have lightning strikes. When there's a buildup of litter like this and a lightning strike, then you will spark a prairie. When there was no one here, that didn't make much different. When the Indians came and found this area productive, they would use places like Vermilion County to come into this site. Then they too began to realize that if you burn a prairie, it improves the prairie, and it improves all the livestock that is there, and they would learn how to burn, and they would burn to their advantage. They would burn in a horseshoe fashion so that the open end is where the creatures would escape, but there the hunters would be able to capture food for their survival. But going back to that primitive method of just waiting for lightning to strike, or early citizens to work with it, we now have to be careful that we burn in small lots. And I usually start with 10 by 10 just to see how the little material works, how damp is it, how smoky it might be, whether the wind is blowing. You're not allowed to burn in anything more than 15 miles an hour. So when I came in this morning, the wind was blowing at more like 30 or 40 miles an hour. And if you have the temerity to light a fire in that sort of wind, then it will go anywhere. And so there are precautions. There should be people with zoot suits that are somewhat fire protected, that can move close to a fire to make sure that it doesn't burn things like telephone junction boxes, or in the case of where there are wooden poles, to burn a pole. There needs to be signs to say that this is a prairie, so the public knows that you're doing something that's helpful rather than something that's off-the-cuff neatness of a corridor. You need flappers that you can make sure that the fire doesn't get out of control. If you light a small segment, you can make wind breaks or fire breaks. So you let a little corridor between the railroad and the road to burn, and you let it burn on the south side and the north side, but then you start to put it out. So you get at least a 3-foot back burn, which prevents the fire from just taking off and burning half a mile. I mentioned the term backburn. We tend to burn into the wind so that the fire doesn't race off. And so backburning means that you're making a slow fire. It's not a burn pile. This is not something that sterilizes the soil for years and years, which is often thought to be a burn, but a burn where you put together the trees that you've removed and put into a stack creates a fire that is very high temperature, and it sterilizes the soil for many years. So if you burning a prairie, you're usually burning lightweight litter. The fire will scud slowly if you're back burning. It'll scud quickly if you're front burning. But you have a flapper, usually made by going to Farm and Fleet and getting a mop bowl and putting on the end of it a rubber that is like what you would have to stop mud from flying out of a semi-trailer. You can get practical, and for a fairly low fee you can create a flapper. You can use a rake to move fire. You can put the rake into the fire and then drag it, but you have to be careful that when you drag, you're not dragging behind someone who's on the other side of that drag. You have to be coordinated. There should be a fire marshal who knows and tells the crew what to do, especially if you have amateurs. Amateurs like to see fire, and there's a temptation to do a front burn without being asked, and they're being very helpful, but sometimes we can have a fire that's an inferno because somebody just lit spontaneously without connecting with the fire leading person. There needs to be water. You need a can of water. It might even be 1,000 gallons of water if you have that sort of equipment. If you have large equipment, you can have a hose from it so that you can hose water, and you can damp down a certain area if a fire is coming toward you and it's going too fast. You can damp that area down. Usually you need a very fine mist spray, and that helps to damp the area down better than if you have a stream of water. But if you don't have that sort of golf cart type supply of water, then you can have a can or two of water. It needs to be a metal can, not a plastic can, because plastic cans get caught by fire and melt. So even just a 2-gallon can of water can be very helpful. You need to make sure that if you're recording the fire, that you don't get too close to the fire, because the Canada balsam glue that glues lens pieces together will melt in your camera. And so if you use a camera, use it as a distance, and perhaps make sure that you don't get overheated. There can be spectators who come and they can be helpful, but they should have been to a fire training school so that they know what you're doing and why. So it also goes reasonably quickly. We do it slowly. We might take half a day to burn a mile of roadside prairie, but it can also go reasonably fast. So it's not something that lingers around for a long time. You have to have railroad tongs which help you to go in. There's a tendency for the fire to move in on old railroad ties that have creosote, and they tend to burn, and they can stay alight for hours, and so you need to go along beforehand to see that you don't have ties sitting in the prairie that will be candidates for that sort of problem. If you do have that problem, sure enough, the small wind will come up at midnight, and you'll have cell phone people who are driving down the highway who will report there is a fire on your prairie, and then you have embarrassment. You have to deal with police and fire people who get annoyed that you've done this. But you also need to have contacted all the agencies involved, whether it be the railroads, the Department of Transportation, or anyone that lives nearby or works nearby. So that notification needs to go out there early. But Route 45 South is a prime candidate for having a controlled burn at this time. And we'll try and put some pictures up that I took the other night just to make sure that you understand what is there. It's highly unlikely that we'll be able to burn because the railroad is reasonably paranoid about the railroad ties, especially burning. And so for years, the South Neal Street Prairie has not been burned because the railroad is adamant that they don't want it burned. But somehow, someplace we have to say that if you want people to see your native vegetation, and it's a very public site, then you need to maintain that, and one of the maintaining mechanisms is to burn. And so then we need to work with 15 attorneys from the railroad company and people from the Department of Transportation and the village of Savoy to make sure that we have our T's crossed and I's dotted, and that is tremendously hard to do. So it hasn't happened for a while, and it may not happen for a while. In emergency, what you could do is probably rake the fuel matrix, but this is not even territory, and it's not a place where you can go in with a mechanical rake and remove dangerous litter sites.
I was going to suggest that you just get a lawnmower that could literally go down to ground level and to just destroy everything in the area. Are you saying that there'd be no way to get anything mechanical in there because there's too much growing stuff and litter?
No, they have been mowing part of this.
I was just thinking of super mowing it. You go all the way down so that there's nothing left. It's down to the dirt level.
Well, the mowers that we use are rotary mowers, and they can do that. Okay. And they can disturb the soil, which also is a problem because that encourages weeds. Right. But what happens to the litter that is created? That is what I'm talking about. It sits there. It's very hard to move. If you had a mower that collected the litter, which is almost impossible in this area, then, and sometimes it's so awkward that the mower has to be on the end of a hi-ho, so that you can lean over from the road and mow. So, yes, your comment is well taken, but this is a type of mowing that's rather rugged. It can have mowers that can take a 6-inch tree and cut it down. That's very different from a lawn mowing. There are people who would like to have this as a lawn because that is neat and tidy, but that is not our local ecosystem and not our heritage. So we'll try and give you some pictures, but to that extent. We're looking at climate change. Pam Iyer, who has an Australian background, called me, and there's a small rat on a little island in between the northern part of Australia and New Guinea. It's an island that is 5 hectares in dimension and 3 feet or 3 meters off the ground. And as water is getting warmer, as storms are getting greater, as the water from the ice melting in the 2 poles is getting larger, this island is endangered, and on it there's an endangered little rat which is called bramble K, and its botanical it's scientific name is melanomus. And this little rat was known. The researchers had adapted, had researched the area, and they had probably 20 or 30 of the living species there. But the problem is with all these things that come with climate change is that there is an administration. So you have researchers that do things, and they suggest to the state and federal agencies involved that this is an endangered species and it's likely to go extinct. This didn't happen in Queensland or in the federal government in Australia. There was no uptake of the proposal that was put in to preserve these creatures, and as they've waited a long time now, and the animal is extinct. So this is one of the first extinctions of mammals due to climate change, and we have to acknowledge that this may be one of just many. As you change the temperature of the world, the cold animals have nowhere to go. There's no more cold above them. And there are certain plants and certain animals that can move and can adapt. Things like mosquitoes can adapt. Ticks, yes. But there are other creatures like this rat that have nowhere to go, and they're losing out. So thank you to Pam for reminding me of that. At the same time, we're talking about fish kills in Australia on the Murray River, which has people who would irrigate the whole corridor, and then when you get, like the Colorado, when you get to the ocean, what's left is salty water and very little of it. So how do you design and control that? And you also have to know that as you add nitrogen and phosphate, and also things like mercury with special chemicals, then you're concentrating that in the water. So then you get fish kills of cod and perch, and so how do we regulate that? One of the problems is that with all these things, if you're in a remote area, there may be rules, there may be ordinances, but people aren't aware of it. They're often not educated in this particular topic. And how do you get to those people and with kindness say, we don't need that sort of activity that is creating a problem in the river. In the Gulf, we're having problems with oysters. Oysters used to grow well and reproduce themselves, and for the last 10 years they've not done that. And then we have research which is specific for that creature, but you have to know that when you do that, it's like working with corn and soybeans. The ecosystem involves hundreds and thousands of interactions, and if we go in to work with one creature like mosquitoes, if you exterminate the mosquitoes, you also relate to everything else. Everything is related to everything else. So we have to be very careful about how we do that. So it's good to have regulations, but then you need teeth in the regulations so that they will be obeyed. But there has to be kindness and understanding that when you do that, sometimes it's taking out your economy. the plant that is benefiting from this specific action is not going to be quite as big and productive as the plant that is targeted for research and development and sale. Another thing that let me see how much I'm here.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. I wanted to say something about this week. There was a bull sale in Springfield, and once again you're talking about specific breeds. You're talking about heritability, and here you have 50 over 100 bulls that will become the breeding stock for cattle, whether they be beef cattle or dairy cattle. This is a science and an art. So you have farmers who become breeding stock. They will breed bulls that then will be distributed to the second level stock dealers who are not necessarily just selling cattle. They're generating the gene pool that will go on to the general public and farmers around. You have to know the heritability of certain traits. There's a very famous case in Australia where a cow was deemed less well bred. But the problem was that the cow had never really been fed very well. So by the time that the educational train reached its limits, the cow was producing in a manner that it hadn't done before because it hadn't had that nutrition. So it didn't prove the point of breeding. So you have to have a knowledge of whether milk production is hereditable. You have to know whether beef production is hereditable. And there's been a tendency lately, this livestock sale has been going on for 50 years. You could have a bull that would be available when cattle went into estrus or sheep went into estrus. And that is kind of friendly. The other alternative is to use artificial insemination, which almost requires a veterinarian, not necessarily, but you have to get sperm from the bull, and that's not an easy thing to do, especially if you don't know the breed and the reaction of the breed. So these animals have been progeny tested. That means that their grandfathers and their fathers and their uncles and their aunts have been assessed for the fecundity of this particular animal. And you can have veterinarians obtain the semen from that animal and put it in cold storage, but bring it to cattle and inject it. And that has been a fairly successful way of upgrading a herd. But it's friendly to have a bull, but you better believe that bulls don't have the same mind as a cow. I grew up with Jersey cows, which are very, very friendly, and but a Jersey bull is not so friendly, and you have to be in corrals that can't be broken down. You have to be in positions where you're not going to get a couple of horns run up your stomach where you're stuck against a fence. So if the animal is well mannered and you have a ring through its nose and you can hold it in a showground with an extended pole to its nose, it's still very friendly and it's there. But people who handle those sorts of livestock are also knowledgeable about their traits. You also have to watch that sometimes there are tricks to the trade. There are tricks to every trade. And one of them is if you have an animal, it should have a straight back. And one of the things that I encountered by going to livestock shows was that people would throw a cold bottle a cold bucket of water on a livestock specimen, and immediately its back would be nice and straight. So if you take that bull to a judging ring, it looks good, but you know that that's not exactly honest as far as working. You also have to be careful that the hooves are going to support that animal. And when I came here, there was a move to have marbled meat. That means you had fat in amongst the meat. And then that changed because it was dictated that an all-fat diet was not a great thing. So then you had to try and breed that marbled meat to be a more proteinaceous meat. And that involves genetics, and that involves statistics, and that involves mathematics, because there's a predictability of these things. If you go to a sheep, there's a little cluster of fibers, and some fibers are more heritable than others, and you don't want a Kemp fiber, which is dark on a light-colored fleece, and it has a heritability that's greater than the basic fibers of the fleece. You also need to know the nutrition. So in the case of sheep, if you had a flock of sheep and you took them to a water-worn landscape where trace elements like molybdenum and copper and zinc were deficient, then, and you grazed them on those pastures, then you could come to a sheep and just lift the fleece off the sheep because the fiber had broken at the base. To avoid that, the researchers provide a little steel pallet, or what would you call it, a pill that's given to the sheep, and it generates just enough molybdenum or copper or zinc to prevent that. If you have too much of that element, that microelement, then you're also going to have poison, because copper in a more vigorous amount is going to be a poison. So this is not simple stuff, and whether it's humans or animals, there's a lot of interaction between various aspects, and if you change one dimension, it's going to change a whole bunch of others. So we need to be careful about what we do when we salt the roads, or we straighten the rivers, or apply fertilizers that may be good for one crop for a period, but after a while in Mesopotamia, when you have irrigation without the appropriate drainage, then the soil becomes salted and you lose your agriculture. So I think that we're coming to the end here, and thanks for listening. And this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.